sports fishing in the Florida Keys. Of course, mankind had been fishing for survival from day one, but over the years it became more less survival and more fun. And eventually it's what it is today, a major industry of people going fishing and becoming fishaholics. That becomes their thing. But I always figured even the early native people, they had more volunteers among the guys that were in the fishing detail than in the berry gathering detail. But anyway, and of course, one of our things we found that people keep photographs. We have them, we call them on our website, the dead fish. And this is one of my favorite dead fish, is a young lad beside Goliath grouper. But obviously he didn't catch that, but it's a great picture by Charlie Anderson. But if you're interested in dead fish pictures, on our library website, on our Flickr page, we have a section. If you go to the library homepage and look under Florida history for Flickr photos, and do a search with, say, fish, and over 1,000 hits of dead fish of various kinds over the years, where everybody kept the catch of their fish. So it's a very popular one of our on our websites. My first record of anybody fishing in Key West for fun, buy some food, was William Hackley in 1831, April 1831, him and the Army major, and originally the lieutenant. They went out fishing in the morning, but didn't have much success. The lieutenant got seasick, so they went back in the afternoon. But they had fine sports and took 110 fish. Now, the early days of fishing was that way. As much fish as you can catch, the biggest ones, and anything in the ocean was considered a good catch. So William R. Hackley caught 110 fish, and he didn't say what kind they were or anything. So like I say, anything counted. They carried harpoons and nets and even sometimes explosives and to improve their catch. This is a guy throwing a harpoon, and they would take anything on the ocean. One of the ones you see a couple photos in our pictures, it's called Ocean Sunfish. He looks like a swimming head when you see it in the ocean. I've only seen one live one and one dead one in my years on the ocean, but this is one that somebody harpooned. It's a vegetarian. It eats seaweed, so nobody's ever caught one that I know of on a tackle, but they harpoon it often because it swims on the surface. And it's very slow and has no basic enemies in the ocean, but except charter fishermen in their slow days would harpoon the sunfish. Is another view of what it looked like. And this is what I said, it looks like a head because it hasn't been cut off. That's is the way it looks. Other things that you see in their catches, that obviously they didn't catch all. A legitimate catch was, here's a catch of sawfish, and they measured the successful day fishing in pounds. This is a report from the Long Key Fishing Camp. We'll cover a little more on it later. But the guy set a one-day record. A team, they caught 356 pounds of fish. Again, they didn't care what kind of fish was, the poundage counted. But one guy was very ambitious. He caught 5 amberjacks, big amberjacks in one day, and that's hard work. Anybody catches 5 big amberjacks in one day had to do a lot of hard work because they're big, stout, biting fish, and he was catching. They were 50, 60-pound amberjacks. But again, the kind of fishing they did, the more fish they caught, the total kill, the total poundage is what counted. Here's an example of a great day. They say a great morning on the water. They got a ray, which obviously they harpooned number of sharks, how they caught those, and a sawfish, all in one morning. So no thing to it. This is another big ray. I don't know how it was caught. Interesting is the gentleman on the right is Ross Saunders, who became famous as Hemingway's fishing guide when he lived in Key West. And he was a model that Hemingway used, charter boat fisherman, in some of his articles and his novel about Key West, Have and Have Not. But one of the best fish tales that I've heard, no holds barred, was a ranger out at the Tortugas. In the 1950s, there was a large Goliath grouper sighted in the moat around the fort. It was coming up in there feeding, obviously. So he saw it. He decided to catch it. So he had an 8-pound mackerel he used for bait, big hook, a rope, and of course it was him, and he couldn't quite handle it by himself. So he had a tractor as he was using as a reel. So it didn't come under any of the rules of fishing, but he was able to pull this Goliath grouper in, and the weight is giving it 850 pounds. I don't know how they weighed it. Of course, there was obviously no scale. At the Tortugas, they could weigh an 850-pound grouper. As an example, I put this up as an example. The photograph here is a 330-pound grouper. So we're talking a fish more than twice the size of that. Now, I've heard rumors that there's a photograph of this 850-pound grouper, and I've looked, and I haven't found it. So if anybody out there has seen a photo or has one, I'd be happy to have a copy of it. But anyway, that's one of the real fish tales that I have. But in the 1930s, there was a group of people decided that there should be a measurement of weight of sports fishing. So the International Game Fish Association was created in 1939, and they have the rules, and they're the record keepers of what is the largest fish caught on the different tackles and so forth. And they put out a yearly catalog of some history about the fishing and the current rules. This is the 2019 catalog that and they're up in South Florida, their headquarters, and they are the arbitrators and the maintenance of the rule book. It's International Game Fish. So they set some rules on fishing. Of course, part of the problem of early fishing was fishing equipment. It came out the best they could find to make fishing rods, where they tried a number of things, but bamboo, certain bamboo, better than others, was used for fishing rods, early fishing rods. One of the problems, though, with the bamboo is you got a big fish, and it will eventually bend the rod permanently. So to overcome that, you notice these do not have a reel on them. The reel was removable because after you caught a big fish, you turn it over. This one has two sets of guides, one on the top and one on the bottom. And so you turn it over and used it on the next big fish, it would pull it back and straighten it. So now, of course, we have all these composites and stuff with high-tech fishing equipment. But this was the beginning of the first really good fishing rod. And they came up with some contraptions. Can you imagine fishing with something like this all day? The high guides were supposed to help keep the bamboo from bending and spreading the torque out over a longer period of a longer stretch of the reel. But I can't imagine fishing with that. Of course, with that, you needed a harness and a chair with a gimbal in it on the boat. So it was not just a rod and reel you needed. Of course, you needed a boat. Now, the reels were another problem, the old early reels. Some of them were 1-to-1. Every time you turned one turn of the handle, you got one turn of the thing. So you could spend a lot of time just reeling up line, empty line, because there was no gearing on it. And you can see, and of course, there was no breathe. So every time a piece of line went off, the reel went back around, handle went around. And of course, it was a good way to hang up your hands if you forgot, which I did when I was a kid sometime, and I would forget. And the other thing was there was no drag or anything on the reel, so you had to prevent it from overrunning and causing a backlash, which would cause your line to get tangled and you'd lose the fish. So the one way was, of course, you could put your thumb on the line. If it was a big fish running very fast, your thumb soon became blistered. So somebody came up with an ingenious to put a piece of leather or a piece of this looks like something else on the hand. So when you put it on to hold the line from running out, you didn't burn your thumb. And they also came up with a way to keep the reel handle from turning every time. They had a free spool on there that you could disengage the handle while you were letting the line out and then re-engage it to fight the fish. So it was always part of it. And one of the guys that solved part of the problem was Mr. Anwonhoff, who was a machinist, who was also a fishaholic. And he's staying here with a big tarpon, they called it long key. And he was a machinist who designed and built some of the early reels with gears and handles and drag and so forth that were part of the modern sports fishing equipment. And of course, the boats had to evolve over the time. This is an early boat, Captain Roberts, and people fishing off of it. But again, there were other ones. Fishing line was another big problem. Before monofilament was linen line. I can remember as a kid, when we would go to the ocean, we fished mostly inland, but we'd go to the ocean and come back. We have linen line, and we'd have to put it on the clothesline to dry it, wash it off, get the salt water off of it. So monofilament was a big improvement. One of the problems they had with monofilament early on, the guys, if you advertised 20-pound test line, so you could put it in the IGFA record book, it's called on 20 pounds. But the manufacturers realized that anything less than 20 pounds, they could be sued for false advertisement. So routinely they would make the monofilament line, instead of 20, it'd be 30, 40-pound test, and then guaranteed to pass the 20-pound test, but was not guaranteed to pass the IGFA test on line. So line was another big problem to overcome in modern fishing. But one of the more famous fishaholics of the early days was Zane Gray. He's mostly known for writing Western novels. He did write Western novels. When he ran out of money fishing, he would go write another novel so he could go fishing again. He was a serious fisherman and ended up being very instrumental in a lot of development of fishing equipment with his money. This is a day's catch he made at Long Key. He fished Long Key, fish camp there, and he wrote a beautiful article about it, fishing at Long Key. He spent a lot of time there, but he went around the world looking for bigger and bigger fish. And he was fishing at Long Key. Long Key was built by the Florida East Coast Railroad. When they started building the railroad to Key West, when they got to Long Key, they built this fishing camp, which became the center of Florida sports fishing in the teens and 20s. It was destroyed in the 35 hurricane. Another early developer of fishing was was a guy named Tommy Guilford. Tommy started in Miami at the famous Pier 9 fishing in Miami, but he moved to Key Largo because it was closer to the fishing ground. But he was a fishing guide and fisherman, and he didn't necessarily invent, but adopted a lot of stuff to sports fishing. Like he was reported to be the first guy to use outriggers in the Atlantic. He used a spotting tower and all sorts of inventive things in fishing. So he's a real founder of modern sports fishing. He stayed up in Key Largo until the 60s. He moved to St. Thomas in his latter days. Here he is. This is him on the left at Key Largo. One of the first documented sports fishing guides we have is Fred Demerit, who died in 1928 in Key West. He was a Key West fishing guide. His family had been involved, and I think it was his father, which I've never proved, taking people out on outings, fishing, hunting on the islands and so forth, camping and so forth. But the Demerit family had been closely associated with sports fishing in the early days, and then he died in 28 and was renowned for his fishing. Of course, what happened in 35, the railroad was wiped out. So with that, what got wiped out was commercial fishing because they had no way to ship fish to New York, which had been on the earth of the mainland, but mainly to New York on the railroad. So a lot of the commercial fishermen became fishing guides. And then in the 30s, some of them were better than others, and some were fishermen, and some were just doing it to try to make a living. But anyway, this is an article from one of the WPA magazines promoting Key West as a fishing resort. And you can see no fish, no pay. They guarantee if you went out fishing, they could catch some kind of fish. And there was charter boats for different places at the time. This was another center of sports fishing. In Keys West was Thompson hardware store, which was on Caroline Street. And he was the only guy that sold fishing equipment, sports fishing equipment in Key West. His name was Charles Thompson. And of course, he is famous for being the guy that took Hemingway out when he got stranded here. And they became close friends, and Hemingway ended up moving here, living here because of the fishing. And Charles Thompson. Charles is the one standing in the back, facing the front. To his right is another Demerit, Watson Demerit, who was a charter boat captain. Sitting in the front are a couple more of our famous early charter boat captains. J.K. Key on the left, Lefty Reagan, and on the right, Johnny Spencer. The guy on the far right, I've been unable to identify, and they're sitting in the Thompson hardware, and you can see the fishing equipment for sale. The guys over to the left are the people who worked in the hardware store. But of course, the one became the famous fisherman was the one that Charles Thompson introduced to Key West as Hemingway, and seems to be fishing was the reason he decided to stay in Key West. Now this is Hemingway, younger Hemingway, without the beard, without the sweater that they have in the Hemingway days. And this is him, what he looked like here. Now, this is probably, we think, taken in Cuba, because when he first bought the Pilar and had it here, he did not have the prime ridge on it. He added the flying ridge after he moved to Cuba. And that was one of the things that Tommy Guilford had introduced it as an advantage to fishing. It gives you a clear view of waters ahead in the activity. And eventually, of course, you'll see boats later on with big towers where they go up. But this was his version of the flying bridge. And he became quite a renowned fisherman. Here he is with Joe Russell with a marlin. And in fact, in the 1950s, the International Game Fish Association and all writers, the expert on marlin, Atlantic marlin fishing was Ernest Hemingway. And he had been one of the founders of the International Game Fish Association. So he was always closely associated with it. And this is him later on, because you can see the modern equipment, and they've caught a big marlin, which was almost impossible with the early fishing equipment. A couple other early fishing pioneers in the Keys. These are three guys from the Middle Keys from Marathon: Elmo Capo, Harry Snow Sr., and Bill Chaplin. All three fishing guides, mostly light tackles, inshore fishing for bonefish, permit, and flats fishing. I like this picture, Harry Snow hiding behind the fish. Harry Snow Sr. His son later, Harry Snow Jr., was another famous fishing guy in the Keys. Another famous guy who promoted Keys fishing is baseball great Ted Williams on the right with Captain Jimmy Albright, who was another famous guy. But Ted was another fishaholic that spent his spare time, in fact, ended up living in Islamorada. So he would be close to the fishing grounds when he was not playing baseball, great baseball. The last man to end the season with a 400 batting average, which meant he had supposedly some of the keenest eyesight. He was also, his baseball career was interrupted twice because he was a Marine Corps fighter pilot in World War II and Korea. Another interesting pioneer, Key West guy who lived here, was Webster Doc Robinson. Most of the fishing done in saltwater, the early fishing, was trolling with some kind of bait, either artificial or natural bait. But to catch that fish on fly rod, the rules established by the International Game Fish Association, you couldn't troll with a fly rod and count as a fly catch. Fly rod requires you to be on a stationary platform and cast to the fish. So Doc Robinson wanted to catch a sailfish on fly rod. And the problem was most sailfish are caught trolling with, like I said. So he devised a method of fishing with his wife. Here they are, Helen. And she was a brilliant fisherman later on in her own right. But here they are with some god-awful trophy they'd won fishing. I don't know where you put that in the house once you win it, but their method of catching a legal fly rod sailfish was, the third member was Captain Lefty Reagan, who we saw earlier, in his boat. So what you did is you went out to the fishing grounds, and they did it off of Central America, where the billfish were very plentiful. And they would troll teasers without hooks in them to get the billfish up. And after the teaser, Helen's job was she kept the teasers going, while Lefty had to get the boat to a stop at a standstill. Helen then would bring in the teasers, and Doc could cast from a stationary platform, and he caught the first billfish, sailfish on fly rod. Another guy who had come over from the commercial fishing was Captain Johnny West, who became a very proficient guy and was extremely thin. And here he is with the movie actress Rita Hayworth. Now the charter boats at the time, after the war in the 30s and then after the war, were on Trumbo Road, which leads out to where the Coast Guard base is today. And you can see them tied up. And you can see them tied up here. And the pier there is on the Trumbo Point now, where the Coast Guard is that day. But they were tied up there. But they were well off the visible tourist range being out there. So the city gave them permission to move to North Roosevelt. In 49, they moved to North Roosevelt and had the charter boat row along here on North Roosevelt. This salt pond here is part of is where the city fire station, police station, and Duncan Ford is, or not Duncan Ford anymore, the Ford dealership. So the charter boats would come in there in the afternoon and tie up. And of course, all the tourists would come to see them, and all the people going up and down North Roosevelt would stop to see what had been caught today. And so every afternoon was a major traffic jam. And the state says we can't have this traffic jam. So they did move them to the other side there. But one of the first ones that appears over there is the first female charter captain, Shirley, Garrison. And all the pictures I see of her, she liked to catch sharks. I don't know much about her other than that. She was, it had been a man's world from the hunter-gatherers on, but someone made a mistake and took their wives. And now as many women fishaholics as there are men fishaholics. So it's an addictive sport. But she was the first one to be a licensed captain. But anyway, they all got moved over to where they are today, alongside the causeway on the Garrison Lake Causeway. Shark fishing. There had been two commercial shark endeavors here, one in Key West in the 20s and 30s, mainly done over on Christmas Tree Island, and one up in Big Pine in the late 40s. The sharks were caught for their leather. They made leather out of the hides. They made, the fins were sold to the Chinese food market for shark fin soup. And the liver was made into oil. And the people of my age who used to get cod liver oil in the morning because it was good for you, well, the codfish had sort of run out by then. But they found out that shark liver was very good, high in vitamins and all that. So it tasted nasty, but we often got a spoonful of cod liver oil in the morning in the wintertime to get us through the winter colds. But shark fishing became a rage in the 70s after Jaws. Everybody wanted to go catch a big white shark. And everybody was fishing for him. This guy's got a 400-pound shark. And I joined for a while there. Till one night I was out there. We were out shark fishing, and usually better at night. And I'd been with this thing for over an hour fighting a large shark. And he eventually cut me off. And, and I realized I don't work as hard as any job I've ever had as this much work. And I don't think I'm going to do this anymore. It's too much work. And then the other thing with sharks, sometimes they're easy to catch than they are to let go. Because once you get one up alongside the boat, he's usually very unhappy and can cause a lot of problems and can be very dangerous. So anyway, after that night, I gave up sharking. But the danger, there is danger to fishing. To own a boat only requires money. It doesn't require any training or smarts or anything. So this guy had, to thrill the people who were out in his boat, he would run under this pier. He had a small, high-speed boat. And he had enough room to run under the pier. And everybody's, and then they go under the pier, and everybody get a good laugh. Well, the guy didn't know about the king tides. And once or twice a month, we go into higher tides than we normally have for a couple of days. Well, he tried it on a king tide, and 3 people died because you couldn't get under the pier. But there was other dangers. When I remember this kid, this happened in my day here. He got a mackerel jumped out, and they got the fish. He actually ended up in the boat, but it hit him in the abdomen, and it turned out it ruptured his spleen. They didn't know it at the time. Of course, he was hurting, and he just got hit by a rather large fish and bruised, and was showing bruises. But then after he got home, he kept getting worse. So they took him to the emergency room and had to do emergency surgery to remove his spleen because it had been ruptured by the hit of this fish. He survived. Another one that didn't was these big rays. It's wintertime. For various reasons, they jump out of the water, and I mean completely out of the water. And they don't seem to be chasing anything. They just do it. Maybe a mating ritual or something. But anyway, this woman had the unfortunate circumstances of it came down in the boat she was in, and she was killed by this ray that had jumped in the boat. And this other one is it's called a houndfish. It's a long fish with a long, narrow beak. And this young lady was either on a pontoon boat or in the water by the pontoon boat. And the fish jumped and stabbed her through the throat, luckily missing the arteries in her throat. But the beak went through, and she had to have surgery and so forth to remove some of the stuff. But she survived that one. But everybody that spent a lot of time on the water has had some kind of encounter with a barracuda. A lot of people have been injured barracudas jumping in the boat after fish, or just accidentally being hooked, whatever, jumping in the boat and getting severe cuts because the barracuda has a lot of teeth. I had my close encounter with a barracuda, personal story. My good friend and John Eckert, who I used to fish together. John later became a charter captain, but at the time he was a master chief in the Navy. I think, or maybe he retired. And we heard about this new fishing lure that was the rage. It's called a tube lure. In fact, we had seen them used in up in New England for striped bass, but nobody had used one down here. And then somebody told us that the barracuda just go bonkers. Well, barracudas were always around pilings, around piers, and they wouldn't usually hit. Only when you finally caught the nice snapper you're going to have for dinner, you're pulling up, you'd cut it in two. So we said, oh, we got to try this. So we acquired some surgical tubing from the Navy hospital and made us a couple of these lures. And went out to one of the places we knew where the barracuda were laying around. And we both cast out there. And it was one of those, I don't believe it, the water exploded. These barracuda that we've thrown 10,000 lures at them over the years. Everybody had stopped to throw a lure and they wouldn't move. We threw 2 of these out there and boom, they were jumping. And John hooked one and I hooked one. Well, even after we were hooked at fish on, the other fish were chasing the tube lure that was hanging out of the barracuda's mouth. And I got cut off. But John still had one on, so he's fighting. So I'm busily tying another tube lure on. And all of a sudden, I get hit. This barracuda that John has on has jumped out of the water and has landed with his head on my shoulder. So I'm sitting there now. I tell the story that it looked like a 40-pound barracuda. Well, most of these barracudas I must admit were 10 to 15 pounds in this group. But when I looked down, the barracuda's head was laying on my left shoulder. And since I don't know if I'm being filmed, but fishermen always like to tell stories how big fish are. Well, I'm sure them teeth look that big to me when I looked at this barracuda. And so luckily my reflexes were good, and in those days, much better than today. And I was able to grab this barracuda and throw it over the side. And he had not hit me with his teeth. And the other big worry, of course, I had to think about, he had this lure in his mouth when he jumped. Well, luckily for me, somewhere along the line, he had lost the lure. And so when he landed on me, he landed flat without the lure, and I was able to throw him back in. But when I turned around, my partner there, John, he was turned white because he just knew I was going to be covered with blood from either the barracuda or the lure or both. And I got out. The fishing gods were with me that day, and I survived my close encounter with the barracuda. Beside the natural tragedies, we had some man-made tragedies with fishing captains, charter captains. One of the first one I've documented was there two guys, William C. and Alvin Tablet, and Tablet's wife, were a couple petty criminals from the Midwest who had decided they were going to, with Table's wife, they were going to go off and live on a deserted island, uninhabited island, i.e. Robinson Crusoe style. And so we don't know if they knew about K-Salt Banks or they happened upon it or something. So anyway, they ended up in Key West and have been leaving bad checks and petty criminal acts throughout Florida, from the Midwest to Florida. So they found a boat for sale, and they gave the guy a bad check, of course. And he wouldn't give them the boat until he cleared the check the next day. But of course, they had found the boat, so they took it that night and took off. Now, we don't, like I said, I don't know if they knew where they were going or what they were going to do, because they got out there and they ran out of gas. But they had gotten close enough that they washed ashore on Elbow Cave and K-Salt Banks. This is the Elbow Cave, and it had a British lighthouse on it, long since abandoned. The intrepid boatmen, they were, got the boat in on the rocks, and the boat got smashed in, and they got ashore. And they found out one thing about uninhabited islands. There wasn't any McDonald's there. They had not bothered to take any food. And on Elbow Cay, there was no water. So they had not taken anything when they stole the boat. So there they are, stranded on Elbow Cay. Along comes they thought was going to be their savior. And they may still do it. I don't know how many of the captains, but the old days, a lot of the captains fishing out of Alamorada used to go across and fish the K-Salt Banks. Excellent fishing, beautiful waters. I made the trip a couple times over there. Since the drugs and the refugees and everything, it's pretty much people don't go to there anymore. But one of the captains did was Captain Boatwright, who fished out of Alamorada. Here is the only picture I've ever found that. He was over there with a party, and he spotted the two guys and the girl on shore calling for help, saw their boat damaged. Well, he was suspicious, and he called the Coast Guard and reported it, and said he would stand by offshore until the Coast Guard arrived. But they induced him to come in. They claimed he had medical, needed help. So he went in to help them, and they grabbed him. And he did have a gun. They took his gun, and they killed Captain Boatwright. Realizing then that the Coast Guard was on the way, they took the boat, Captain Boatwright's boat, put his passengers ashore on Quezon, and C's wife also ashore. And they took off. This is 1960. So their great thought was, well, we got all this trouble, but if we get to Cuba, Castro won't give us back to the United States because we were breaking diplomatic relations and so forth. And they were right. It probably wouldn't have been given back to the United States. But the murder and piracy had happened on Quezon, which at that time was part of the British Empire. Bahamas was part of the British Empire. And they still had diplomatic relations with Castro Cuba. And they requested to be extradited to Nassau. And they were taken to Nassau, and both of them were hanged. The wife, C's wife, was left there, and she disappears to history. Nobody prosecuted her. The other one was 1963. The Trevors, father and son on the right, father and son. Charter boat Dream Girl. This is one of their happy day catches. Were chartered by a guy named Roger Foster, and they took him out. Foster was later found on the boat, Dream Girl. The boat was covered in blood. The bodies of the captain and his son were never found. Foster was covered in blood. This is him after the Coast Guard found the boat and brought him in. This is him under arrest by the county sheriff. You can see his shirt's covered in blood. He pleaded insanity at the time, and then in 1971 he was declared sane and was tried for murder and sent to prison. He may be out now. I couldn't find his status of what happened to him after. I think he got 30 years in 71. The other case was in Captain Hans Bungard. It was chartered, as Hans is on the right here. And his other boat, he had a smaller boat that he took out, smaller cruise, and he was chartered by two men. It turned out to be two Cuban refugees were trying to get back to Cuba. And they threw Hans over. He evidently drowned after they threw him over, and it confiscated his boat. But one thing they didn't know, that everybody that knew Hans was always sort of short of money. And he probably never had a full tank of gas in any of his boats at any time. And so they shortly after they ran out of gas, and they were captured by the Coast Guard and brought back and tried for murder. There was tragedy, so now a lot of more precautions, and there's a lot better communications and so forth. But anyway, a few fish tales. What's a fishing story without fish tales? I said earlier, one of the early, before the Long Key, Pier 9 in Miami was sort of considered the sports fishing capital of the east coast of Florida. And they would run out of there with big houseboats, luxury houseboats, and they would tow along behind them small boats, which would they would come down to the Keys and go fishing. Mostly they were fishing at that time for tarpon. They had not developed the skill and so forth for the big billfish and the marlin and so forth. So tarpon was a big catch. So you had the one manpower engine on your small boat, and you went out trolling for tarpon. They're at Bay of Honda, and you can see here a guy caught one of the tarpon with one of the tarpon. But the prize at the time, this is early 1900, was one that everybody was looking for, was the 200-pound tarpon. And you can see the Bay of Honda Bridge in the background of this tarpon jumping. But Mr. George Danbury caught the 200-pounder, 213-pound tarpon. Well, and that was quite an achievement. And so they decided that they should have this mounted. This is the record everybody's going to have. So, of course, they were operating out of Miami, but they didn't want to cut their trip. So what they did, at the time, the Florida East Coast Railroad was running a boat from Miami to Key West that ran inshore, and he would stop and pick up fruit and other cargo going either way. And so the crew, Mr. Danbury, flagged down the city of Key West and gave him the 200-pound tarpon to take to Miami and have it mounted. And he'd pick it up when he got back to Miami. So, well, Captain Stephen Bravo of the city of Key West, I guess he did. I never found out if he got the tarpon mounted or if he got them. But Captain Bravo did go over and have his picture made with Mr. Danbury's 200-pound. Now, one thing you'll notice about fishtails, sometimes the fish gains weight the time it's caught. Now, he's going to 240 pounds here by Mr. Bravo. So Mr. Bravo has his picture taken with a rod and reel standing by this tarpon and has a picture postcard made of it and sends it to his friends with his Mr. Danbury's tarpon. So he claims that it's 240 pounds. But we did get a picture of the 240-pound tarpon just because of this. It's one of the surviving postcards, the only one I've found of the big tarpon. I don't know what happened to if Mr. Danbury actually got to mount and took it back to where he was from up north or not. But it was a good story from Captain Stephen Bravo. And he ran that boat for years between Key West. And in fact, if you follow Mae Johnson's diary, she meets Mr. Bravo and goes to La Brisa with him a couple of times. The next 200-pound tarpon was in 1975, Captain Bob West, who was the son of Captain Johnny West, who we saw earlier, who specialized in tarpon fishing. Well, Bob caught the next one, which was weighed on tournament scales by GFA standards and was 243 pounds. This is Bob in the center. The guy who caught the tarpon was on the right. But now the record's been surpassed. Not by, this is the largest one ever caught in Florida. There's one other 200-pound caught on the west coast of Florida. But the largest one, Bob, the largest tarpon now are being caught off the west coast of Africa. And now we have, of course, we had some presidents for fishaholics. President Hoover was probably the greatest fishaholic president. And he even wrote some books about fishing. But he was a routine fisherman, particularly after World War II. After his presidency, he would spend some time every winter at the Key Largo Anglers Club fishing. And the captain that fished with him was Captain Albury. This is a painting of them that's in the Key Largo Angler Club. Our connection besides Captain Albury's wife, Lenora, was one of the founders of the our Key Largo Branch Library, and for many years she was the manager of the Key Largo Branch Library. So we have a close connection with Captain Albert and President Hoover. One of the questions, this is the Key Largo Anglers Cup up on Upper Key Largo. It was asked to Captain Albury, because you always see President Hoover with his coat and tie on going out fishing. And somebody asked Captain Albury, said, did he always wear his coat and tie? He said, yeah. I said, when we got out to the fishing grounds, he normally, it was a warm day, he would take the coat off, but never the tie. So he was always formally dressed while he was fishing. Another one before he was President Roosevelt, who was part owner of a houseboat operating out of Miami. And here he is with a large Goliath grouper. All sorts of stories about that. But almost assuredly, President didn't catch him. But he did love to fish. He was another one. Another president that was caught fishing with this picture, he actually said he didn't like fishing. His wife loved to go fishing, he said. But when she went fishing, he had to go along and bait the hook and take the fish off. So he had this aversion to fishing, but he did get caught with catching a grouper at one of his stays in Key West. The other president that spent a lot of time here fishing was President George Bush, who was fishing out of Cheetah Lodge during his presidency and after, until he became too infirm to go fishing. They still have the fishing tournament named for him up there. The other group of people who spread the fishing fame was the military guys here. In fact, it was a guy who had stationed here. I think he was my executive officer on a destroyer. And I was getting orders, and I told him I was trying to go back. I'd been in North Park. I was trying to go to Orlando, and he said, oh, no, the place for you is Key West, because you like to fish so much. So that's sort of how I got to Key West, was his promoting me, because he had been here. He was not a fisherman. He said, everybody there is a fisherman. So they promoted to Key West as a fishing thing. But the Gunzilla story I'll end with is, again, operating out, Captain Charles Thompson, operating a houseboat out of Pier 9, Miami, was down off of the 7 Mile Bridge. I'm sure it was the spring of 1912. The railroad had just opened, the railroad had been completed. And he was, of course, part of the fishing trip would have been to show his clients the new 7 Mile Bridge. While he was doing that, he spotted Gunzilla in the shallow waters near, and was able to harpoon him. Of course, he couldn't catch him, but he harpooned him, brought him alongside his houseboat, the Samoa. And this is it alongside. They were able to get it back. It took them 24 hours for the fish to die. It's well documented. 38 foot long. And he got it back to Miami. And of course, to mount it there was no way you could mount a fish that size at that time. But he did get it formaldehyde. And there he is standing beside it, Captain Charles Thompson, and his catch, which turned out to be a whale shark. And he had it mounted on a railroad type car and took it around the country, showing it all, charging, of course, admission for it. You can see 20 to 30,000 pound estimated weight, something most people say mid 20,000 pounds. The Gunzilla fish story of the Florida Keys. And unfortunately, he had it mounted as best he could with formaldehyde. And he said he was buying formaldehyde by 5-gallon buckets and pouring it in there to try to keep it. But eventually the smell became overpowering, and either he or somebody decided enough and set it on fire and destroyed it. But we now know what Godzilla looks like, unless somebody can come up with a better story. That's my Godzilla.